Good morning or afternoon. Welcome to the second panel of today's Land of Hope and Dreams event, a celebration of Dave Marsh's work and vision. I'm Eric Schumacher-Rasmussen. I'm one of the organizers, and this event has been a year and a half in the making, and we are so thrilled that it is finally happening. And while music journalism is at the center of the story that we're trying to tell over the next 3 weekends about Dave Marsh, we want to be sure the Land of Hope and Dreams holds true to Dave's vision and his never-ending quest to build bridges between different audiences, between different worlds, music, politics, healthcare, social justice. And so over the next 3 weekends, there's going to be panels looking at all of those things and more. And our speakers come from everywhere, but all of them share a passion and commitment to that same vision. I'd like to thank all my fellow steering committee members for helping to make this happen. It's been a real group effort. And I'd also like to thank our partners, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Afro-American Studies Department, who have helped us promote this event. And the Rock Hall will actually be simulcasting the live stream of Dave Marsh and Daniel Wolf's conversation on their YouTube channel on May 14th. And all of these conversations will be archived on our YouTube channel, and they are also being simulcast live on our YouTube channel as well. So let's move on to a discussion about on listening. And for each of our panels, we have a message from a musician or another writer that relates to the topic at hand. And so I'd like to start things off by playing a message from Ray Wiley Hubbard.
So for some reason, I was riding with Dave in New York City to do his radio show. I think I was promoting a record and everything. So we were listening to the radio, some classic rock station, and all of a sudden, It's Only Rock and Roll came on by the Stones. Dave lost it. He goes, it's not only rock and roll, it's rock and roll. It's not only rock and roll. You just wrote that so you can impress your rich bourgeois friends. And it was pretty scary. And so anyhow, a little bit later, I kind of had that thought, and I came up with this chorus. It'll live and die, rock and roll. It ain't something you control. Stratocaster heart and a high-watt soul. It'll live and die, rock and roll. So anyhow, I believed it. Take care, Dave.
Thank you to Ray Wiley Hubbard. And I think to one degree or another, we're all here because we believed it and we believed Dave, that it ain't just only rock and roll. A couple housekeeping notes. The chat is not open to the audience, but if you have questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end of the discussion. If you raise your hand in the as an attendee, we're just going to put it down only because we really need questions to go in the Q&A. It's a lot easier for us to monitor them there. So getting on to our panelists, I am thrilled to have 4 amazing people here with us today. First up is David Cantwell, and David writes frequently for The New Yorker, Rolling Stone Country, and others. He's also the author of a terrific book on Merle Haggard called The Running Kind, which will be out in a revised and expanded edition, I believe in spring 2022, right, David?
That's right, yes.
And he's, of course, the author of Heartaches by the Number, or co-author of Heartaches by the Number, the country music's 500 greatest singles, which was, I believe, inspired in part by Dave Marsh's Heart of Rock and Soul, the 1001 Greatest Records, right?
Yeah, it's a country version of that book.
Excellent, and it's a terrific. Track it down if you can. Next up is Annie Zalewski. Annie is a Cleveland-based journalist who's been published just about everywhere that publishes writing about music. Hey, Annie.
Hi.
And she's written many liner notes, including for the 2016 reissue of REM's Out of Time. And she has a brand new book coming out. It's out now, actually, and there it is. It's part of the 33 1/3 series about Duran Duran's Rio. So it's available now, right, Annie?
It's available Thursday.
Thursday. All right. Got to wait a few more days. And up next is Steve Messick. And Steve was, and maybe I shouldn't say was, a contributing editor to Rock and Rap Confidential, and before that, Rock and Roll Confidential. Hey, Steve.
Eric, how's it going?
Good, good. I was trying to find my copy of the Rock and Roll Confidential Reader this morning, and I couldn't find it. So, but that was a terrific collection of things that had appeared in Rock and Roll Confidential. And I'm not going to say was, and I shouldn't have, because it's never officially ceased publication, right? It could rear its head at any time.
Well, I'll get an email blast, or I guess we do it online now, and when it pop up every now and again, you're like, "Well, I thought we were done with that, but we're not."
Right. Now, Steve is also a guitarist and harmonica player, and these days he can be found writing absolutely terrific commentary and reviews about whichever artist he feels like at the moment on his Facebook feed. So it's worth following if you don't already. And last but not least, Alejandro Escovado. Probably needs no introduction to this group, but Alejandro, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'll give you an introduction anyway, even if you don't need one. Alejandro is an accomplished musician whose work straddles multiple genres, from punk rock to Americana to chamber pop, even musical theater. His latest album, and I'll hold it up because I have it right here, is The Crossing. I have the English language version here, but he and his co-creator Don Antonio also recently recorded a Spanish language version, right?
That's correct, yes.
And so Alejandro is also the founder of the Sims Foundation, which is an organization that's devoted to getting mental health and other health care to musicians in Austin and beyond. And he's working quite actively on that front. And he's a national spokesperson for the Prevent Cancer Foundation. So thanks to our panelists for joining us. I'm a former music journalist for MTVnews.com. I've written for a number of alt weeklies. I was the regular rock critic for the Capital Times newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin. And I've written for Paste, Harp, Blurt, and a whole other magazines, although I haven't been doing so much lately. I learned a lot about listening from Dave Marsh, and I know our panelists did as well. And so today we're going to be talking about listening from all sorts of different angles, as a fan, as a critic, as a musician, as well as how critics and musicians hope our audiences listen to us. And of course, Dave's work will be the thread that ties that all together. I've got a lot of questions here. I don't know if we'll have time, and I do want to make sure we have time for audience questions at the end. But let's start with this one, if you can. Do you remember the first encounter you had with Dave Marsh's work? Was it a specific review, article, or book? And what did it teach you about listening, if you can recall? Anyone who wants to go first, go ahead.
Yeah, would actually be in Rolling Stone. It was the Back to College issue of '79. It had an excerpt of the Born to Run book. So I knew Springsteen from two songs, Prove It All Night and what's the other one? Oh yeah, Born to Run. And so I'm reading this and I'm thinking, wow, first off, Bruce Springsteen seems really cool to me, but so does this Dave Marsh guy. So I get the book for Christmas, and I think I probably got the first red or orange cover of the Rolling Stone Record Review at the same time, because they both came out in '79. So that was pretty much, that was my introduction. And the important thing about that was really the book was important, but in the back of the Springsteen book, he puts a list of all these songs that Springsteen was covering at the time. And that was the thing to me, because that sent me back. All right, I'm talking too much. All right, I'm done.
Yeah, well, I subscribed to Rolling Stone in high school. I graduated in '80, but I don't remember. I'm sure I read Dave Marsh pieces, but I don't remember the byline sticking until I got into college. And that's when I picked up the new Rolling Stone record guide, the blue one, which I devoured and used to sort of go back and discover that one. To begin a record collection and sort of educating myself on all the stuff that I'd missed, which was most of everything. But the specific piece that really punched me in the gut, and I feel like it marked me in some way, was the introductory essay to his book, his collection, Fortunate Son, which came out in 1985. It's just one of the most, it's a great memoir essay. It's like E.B. White good, James Baldwin good. And it really just, it also, a lot of the things he describes as happening to him, I'd never heard anyone talking about. He's describing his blue collar, white working class youth, and it was so specific to so much of it to what my own experience had been, and I'd never seen it in print, and it just, you know, exploded my head. And maybe we'll talk more about that essay later.
Yeah, for sure. And I just posted a link in the chat so that attendees, if you haven't found them on the website, the conference website, some of the readings that we're referencing today are there for download. Annie, how about you?
So I think I'm a little younger than some of the people here. And so to me, Dave Marsh was always there. He was just this totemic critic. You know, when you talk about, you know, the great rock critics of the 70s and 80s, I mean, it was, you know, Dave Marsh, it was a no-brainer. You know, and so because I'm going back and I was reading a little more, you know, probably retrospectively, because we've amassed Cream magazines and record guides in our house everywhere. I think what really stood out to me is just how detailed and perceptive. First off, he's an amazing writer. It makes me jealous reading everything he's written because I wish I could be that good. But he really does such a wonderful job of connecting the dots between things you wouldn't expect. You know, David just mentioned A Fortunate Son introduction, and he starts off quoting Michael Stanley, who's from Cleveland, where I grew up. But my grandfather worked for the GM plant. And so I was able to sort of read this and apply my own experiences to this, but then, you know, see it how it kind of expanded beyond that. And, you know, you always like end his pieces of work wanting to know more and read more and thinking about things in a different way. And those are the writers I always gravitate toward. And I think, I mean, to a fault, almost everything I've written by him like makes me feel that way.
Perfect. Alejandro, how about you?
I go back to early 70s Cream magazine and that generation of writers like Richard Meltzer and Lenny Kaye and Lester Bangs, of course, and all those guys. But what drew me especially to Dave was just his, you know, I think Fortunate Son is a great example of the passion he has for music. And for me, I think it helped develop this sense when we were young, especially with Cream magazine, the irreverence it had for music, and music either sucked or didn't suck in a way, you know. And when someone wrote about something, it was so passionate, especially Dave. And I think Fortunate Son is probably the best example of just how much the music means to him, and all the people that he wrote about, which I didn't know about, I suddenly was very interested in, you know. And so Dave has been influential in a big way in shaping how I listen to music and the type of music that I'm attracted to, you know. And I think over the years, he also showed a lot of interest in Chicano music and Texas, you know, where I'm from. So that drew me to him also, you know. So that's but mostly Cream magazine was my thing, you know.
Yeah, and we just finished a great panel called Cream Magazine and the Origins of Rock Writing, where some of the Cream folks who worked with Dave and some who came after him talked about that long-lasting impact of Cream. I'd like to get back to the essay you just mentioned, or the introduction you just mentioned, David, that introduction to Fortunate Son, as well as a piece called The Lonesome Death of Florence Thompson. And both of those show Dave emphasizing the intersection of the musical, the cultural, the social, the political, that's always been, you know, at the center of everything he's done. I sort of call it the functional importance of music in living a life. You know, when Ray Wiley told that story before about, no, it ain't only rock and roll.
Right.
It's about something more than that. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose those pieces and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll try and do this really quickly. So here's the book we're talking about, Fortunate Son, which needs to be brought back into print ASAP.
I'll just interject really quickly, David, because I do want to say it. In addition to that, seconding that, there's movement behind the scenes to create a Fortunate Son Part 2, where anthologizing his writings from 1985 forward, which I think is when that book was published. But back to you.
The two essays I chose, The Lonesome Death of Florence Thompson, was a piece that he wrote in 1983 for Record magazine, and it was written on the occasion of the death of Florence Thompson. She, if you don't recognize the name, was the woman who was the migrant mother, the Madonna of the Depression that Dorothea Lange took such a famous photograph of, right? And so he talks about her life and what little we know about it. He talks about Lange, he talks about beauty, he talks about art. And all of this, of course, gets him back to rock and roll. And I just wanted to, and it also, he eventually gets to talking about the Stanley Brothers and their 1960 recording. It seems so much more ancient, but 1960 recording of Rank Strangers. And so all of this is in this swirl, which I had never really seen this kind of stuff all together before. And I'd never really seen, just as an aside, I've really focused on country music in my later stuff that I've written. And it's, I'd never seen anyone sort of write about country music like rock critics wrote about rock music. And that in itself was something very important to me. But in the middle of this piece, he writes a brief, just a couple of sentences that I'm actually going to read. I've always felt that one of the secret strengths of rock and roll was that it provided a voice and a face for the forgotten and disenfranchised. At least in its beginnings, rock was one of the few ways that poor people, country people, Black people, Southerners, had of making themselves visible in a country whose media increasingly depicted as solely urban, affluent, white, and Northern. And, you know, I think if he took a pass at that list today, he might expand it a little, include some other groups whose voices are not heard as well. But that always stood out to me as kind of like a thesis statement for like his career. This is the thing that he wants to do, the thing that he wants to prove and to point out and to be a voice for these people in the way that the music has been. The other essay, the introduction to that collection is, as I've said, is fantastic. It's, I'll spend just a couple of minutes summarizing it. You should read it. He's growing up in Pontiac, Michigan. His dad works for GM and for the railroad, or actually works surrounding the GM complex, helping to bring in supplies and shipping out parts to different parts of the country. And it's all of the whole story, particularly the first part of the essay is all about all the limits that he encounters, the limits of the boundaries of his neighborhood, the limits that are imposed upon him and his family by these powerful people who run GM and who make decisions that he has absolutely no say in. For example, he points out that the story is basically about the time that he and his family had to move because GM just shows up at the house and says, we're turning this whole neighborhood into a parking lot. And it's not, let's have a discussion. It's, you're going to do it. Here are the terms. And, you know, another class of people put it somewhere just below, as Merle Haggard might have sung, did sing later. Then he talks about how within that community, one of the reasons, one of the explanations that was frequently given for why the white working class people in his neighborhood could never get ahead was that Black people were moving into the neighborhood, competing for jobs, competing for homes, racism, right? Another limit. He talks about how the feelings of longing and vulnerability that he was having at the time were things that a man was not supposed to express growing up in his place and time too. And so there's all these limits. And then one night he's wrestling with this in his new suburban neighborhood. And he hears a record, You Really Got a Hold on Me by Smokey Robinson. And I'm gonna read some more, okay? He'd heard this record before, but it had never grabbed me in quite this way, as a lifeline that insisted that these singers spoke for me as well as to me, and that what they felt and were able to cope with, the deep sorrow, remorse, anger, lust, and compassion that bubbled beneath the music, I would also be able to feel and contain. This intimate revelation was what I gleaned from those 3 minutes of music. Then a little later on, Robinson was putting his finger firmly upon a crucial feeling of vulnerability and longing. It's hard to think of two emotions that a 14-year-old might feel more deeply. Well, there's lust. And yet in my hometown, expressing them was all but absolutely forbidden to men. And one final. The depth of feeling in that Miracles record, which could have been purchased for 69 cents at any Kmart, overthrew the premise of racism, which was that Blacks were not as human as we, that they could not feel, much less express their feelings as deeply as we did. When the veil of racism was torn from my eyes, everything else that I knew or had been told was true for 14 years was necessarily called into question. For if racism explained everything, then without racism, not a single commonplace explanation made any sense. Nothing else could be taken at face value. And that meant asking every question once again. And I wanted to spend a second, talking about that, because I think what we get here, this is like the Dave Marsh origin story, right? And it's, he's not bit by a radioactive spider, he's bit by a Motown 45, right? And his superpowers are a gift for close listening, empathy that abuts with righteous anger on a routine basis, a willingness to question bedrock assumptions, in a way that, he's the chip on Dave's shoulder, the infamous chip on Dave's shoulder, is also constantly morphing into the heart on his sleeve, right? This is just something that's just really remarkable. And all of this comes through in his writing. He, like he says in that piece about the Robinson record, he wrote, for one thing, for an audience, not to or at an audience. And I felt that really deeply when I first encountered the piece as well. And I've taught the piece many times and have students react similarly. And then the other thing that I think that comes through in that piece and through the best of all of his work is that Dave is not content to merely interpret the world. He wants to change it. And all of his writing is pushing in that direction to make the world a better place. That's why I chose those pieces.
I did a panel at South by Southwest one year that Dave moderated, which was racism in the music industry, basically. And it was Cyril Neville, Chuck D, Garland Jeffries, and myself. And when it began, Dave told a story, basically kind of like the introduction to Fortunate Son, about his background. And he spoke about, I believe it was one of his relatives, like his grandfather, who was kind of a racist, apparently, And he starts telling the story, and he gets so deep into the story that he becomes very emotional, And every time I've heard Dave speak about things such as what you're talking of now, he gets this really deep emotional thing about him, like the first time, Eric, we spoke about that, it was the Woody Guthrie tribute it was in Cleveland, right? The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame did it.
Yeah, exactly.
That
That's
was
the poster right over my shoulder here.
Yeah, that was my first experience. Well, that was the first time I met Dave personally, in person. And he moderated that thing where we talked about, our families. And I sang a song called, I think it was called The Rain Won't Help You When It's Over. This song, one of the first songs I wrote about my family and the border and them traveling across the border. And once again, in performing that song, I remember looking over at him, and he was very emotional about the song. And I've always loved that about Dave, about his compassion for people and social injustice, racism. And it really is just kind of like deeply embedded in him, and the way he articulates it is beautifully. And it's just something that's always struck me as very powerful, in his writing. And I think that's a rarity in this day and age. We don't have enough writers like Dave. But that's something I really love about him.
And building on that,
That's
then, and before, when David read the passage from The Lonesome Death of Florence Thompson, the lines before that just like stood out to me. I'm gonna read them. He said, "The real point is that we know almost nothing about how Florence Thompson felt that evening or in the months and years afterwards when her face became famous. We don't really expect to know, which is shameful." And that, like, when I read that, I just I wanted to underline on my computer screen, because I think now we're grappling so much with, there's so much art that's been made at the expense of people, and we haven't really thought on the other side is that how do they feel? And that deep empathy it just stood out, everything. And the fact that he developed this so early too. I mean, reading the other essay too, I mean, how many teenagers are really thinking about topics of racism so deeply? When you're 14, and it's very, you don't necessarily have just the mental and emotional capacity to even consider me and the world around you. You're often so self-absorbed at that age. And I think that's really striking too, is that from a very, very early age, so much of his listening was also informed by that. And, he was able to kind of have that perception very, very early on that, hey, there's a lot more going on. And I think that really, knowing that, listening, art is not made in a vacuum, and listening is also not happening in a vacuum. So as he's listening to this music, there's a lot of other cultural context going on. And that really informed how he kind of developed as a writer and as a listener.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about that, the title of that collection is Fortunate Son. And in Fogarty's, in the CCR version, that title is ironic. But it's not ironic in Marsh's book, right? He's fortunate because he's had the revelations that you're talking about, Annie, because that he's had this, that he's been able to see, that he's been able to re-question everything because of the experiences he's had.
And I mean, I think, sorry, go on.
No, go.
And I was going to say, to add to that, I think that he was also aware that he sort of had this position and privilege too. I think in modern rock criticism, there's a lot of talk about that, but he very early on realized, I have this voice, and he used it in, he didn't take that for granted. He knew that he had a position and something to say, but he also knew he was able to kind of try to help change people's minds and point out things maybe they didn't see for whatever reason. And that's, which is also so valuable. And I agree. I wish there were more writers and places to be able to talk about that.
I mean, I'm glad Dave picked the introduction, because it's something, when you go back to an anthology, you usually pick up, one of the chapters in between, but nobody really goes back and reads the introduction. And I hadn't read it in a long time. And I'm reading it, I'm thinking, oh shit, this is I grew up that way. And he doesn't really get into the specifics, but I mean, you get the sense that he's acknowledged that he was not always the enlightened person that we know him to be. And when I meet people, I meet people who are like me now, I always think they're fully formed. And I'm thinking, I was not fully formed. I've said and done things that I'm not happy about, when I was younger. And Dave kind of acknowledges that. And I was glad to see that. I was going somewhere with this, I don't know where it is, but yeah, I agree. Just a really great piece of writing, and make, the empathy and I don't know, the realizations, I guess.
As I think about the comments that all of you just made, I'm thinking about the role of the critic and the musician and the listener. And when I came at this panel as the moderator and saw it was about on listening, and if we have time later on, we'll get to questions about listening in different ways and to different things. But, one of the roles of a critic, if they're doing it right, is, not to necessarily make a grand pronouncement, even though Dave has made many grand pronouncements over the years, and critics do. And one of the things that critics especially love about each other is when they make grand pronouncements about things being shit. But, more importantly, Dave's writing for me served as a conduit between me, the music, and it helped me understand myself better by listening to him, not literally listening, but by listening to him as a writer. And there's sort of he manages to be both authoritative and leave the door open to the reader's personal experience as well. And I think it's not entirely unique, but it's rare. It's rare. The other thing that comes through in David's writing, and Annie, when I think about some of your writing, I think about the fact that you're unabashedly a fan of what you write about, and you don't try to hide it. You don't gush just because you're a fan, but most music critics are fans first. And Patty Griffin, she recorded a wonderful introduction to the Dave Marsh interview with Daniel Wolf that we'll be playing in a couple of weeks. And she talks about Dave being such a fan of the music. And I'd like to maybe talk about that for a little bit. How important do you think that being a fan is to being a good critic and a good listener? And also, can being a fan sometimes cloud your judgment? talk about fandom a little bit.
Such a good question, because I think a lot of times when people mention fandom, it's as a pejorative. You might hear the term fangirl, which is not meant as a term of endearment, but as a meant of, if you're a fangirl, it's a very condescending term that, you can't possibly have good taste in music, or you can't possibly know anything because, you are just a fan. And I've always been extremely against that characterization. That actually makes me angry. Because, being a fan, you have context and you have passion, which we've talked about already. You have passion for the music and you have context for it. If you're a fan, chances are maybe you've read interviews with the artist a lot. So you can hear a song they did and say, oh, okay, I see where they were coming from because I hear them talk about this. Or you can have context and say, all right, well, they really like this artist and I can see what they were going for. Maybe there's an homage there. It makes you a better and more informed critic if you know the artist well. At the same time, and I think this actually came up in the previous panel about, being a fan of an artist or being like a friend of an artist. You can cloud your judgment. If you are too close to an artist, sometimes if you're friends with them, or if just, your fandom is so deep, you can't be objective. That actually can be difficult. There are some artists that I don't think I can write about anymore because I don't, I'm just too close to it. But at the same time, I think, you get better criticism because you also care. I think it's much harder to write about an artist that you like and care about rather than an artist maybe that it's like, okay, I was assigned this record review. Sure, I'll just write it. Why not? And you have no emotional connection to the artist. If you're emotionally connected to an artist, I think, at least for me personally, I'm a lot more careful what I write about because I care about the band and I care about the music. And I want to make sure that that's kind of that same care goes into it. And I'll probably listen a lot closer and I'll try to explain things a little better. Like it pushes me a little bit, and I think also in that same sense too, I think being a fan also kind of prevents me sometimes from being too negative. I think it is very easy sometimes just to be like, I'm just going to be snarky, like privately. And I think in private conversations, there are always records we hear and you'll like snark on it and make a comment, but that wouldn't necessarily go into a professional review, because you realize you have a responsibility, to the artist, and you have a responsibility to the fans too, just to give it a fair shake, because there's a ton of terrible albums out there that are released. And a lot of times it's almost not worth writing about that. Fandom is such a big topic right now because of the rise of social media and of like quote unquote fan armies or stands, that if you write a negative review of an artist, you can get doxxed, you can get, basically harassed on social media. It's really, really striking. And so this has been a really big topic, especially around women critics I'm friends with, because there's the balance of, is it worth writing a review that might have you be harassed online? Is it worth, I know people who have passed on writing about certain artists because it's just not worth it. And I think in that case, that's when fandom is a little bit overboard. And, and that's a little bit more like less me being a fan and more others, but it's all interconnected, because it all comes down to passion. And I think that's something that, can be used in a good way and also, potentially in a negative way. But I don't know, it's a really big topic, to say the least.
One thing that I would about, you were talking about, there are a lot of bad records out there and why even write about them? But one thing that I have I didn't actually learn this from Dave. I learned this, or I had this pointed out to me by the classical critic, Charles Rosen. And he talks about, when you're writing about music that you don't like, one thing to do though is to try to say, okay, so people who are fans of this, what are they getting out of it? What are they looking for in it? How do they use it? And when he talks about his own work, he talks about how he wants to make sure I maintain the possibility of love within my listening, right? And so I've always tried to, when I'm listening, I think that when I'm listening to music by an artist I'm a fan of, one reason I'm a fan of it is because I feel like I actually hear it. I feel like I can hear it better than other people. But other times when I'm listening to things that I'm not a fan of, I try to get into a fan mindset, at least for a moment, to try to sort of use that as a way into the music. And maybe I'm holding it up to criteria that its partisans don't even care about. And so I need to hear it differently.
So I'd love that. Yeah, I just want to say I love that. That's very well said.
You know, as a musician, my whole life started out as a fan, right? Collecting records and listening to records, dancing to records, making love to records. I loved music, all types of music, you know. As I didn't start playing in a band till I was 24, you know, I was older, you know. And so like all the guys that I loved, you know, like Iggy Pop and Ian Hunter, you know, Ronnie Lane of the Faces, Ian Mac and those guys, I was totally in awe of. I was fanboy for all those guys, you know. And we would follow them around like puppy dogs, wherever they were, you know. Every show we'd be in front of Ronnie Lane, you know, or Iggy, I'd go to everything that I could find about Iggy Pop. And so when I finally became a musician, and like I remember once the True Believers were playing at the Club Lingerie in Hollywood, and our first record was coming out, and it was a full house, and it was a big deal, and we were having a great time. And out in the audience was Iggy was dancing to "We Were Doing I Want to Be Your Dog," you know, and he was out there dancing with everybody else. So it's really kind of like sometimes it's really hard to believe that these people are listening to me. You know, I always felt like when they did the tribute album for me when I was sick, and the first two tracks I got back, the first one was from John Cale. He did this beautiful version of a song of mine. And then the second one was from Ian Hunter. And I always used to say, I mean, they kind of like, you know, I was trying to rip them off all this time. And now they've given it back to me in the way that it probably should have been done in the first place, in a way, you know. But I remember Cale telling me that you have to stop thinking of us like a fanboy. You have to think of us as a peer, you know. And it's just something I've never been able to wrap my head around, you know. I'm still a fanboy. I still get impressed by performances by Ian Hunter and Iggy Pop, and you know, I'm in the front row. I love that stuff. So I don't know, it's a weird thing, fandom, but I think it's really important, like Annie was saying, that, you know, you have a passion for this music. And as a critic, I'm not a critic. I'm critical about music, but I don't write about it, you know. But I just think that, you know, it's important to have that passion, that love for it. Like, you know, you hold on to bands like nobody else in the world does, like they're yours, you know, and it means so much to you. It's everything, you know. So I don't know, that's my take on fandom. You know, I feel like I'm still a fan, you know.
I think a lot of people who enjoy Dave's writing, and it is in the Fortunate Son book, the chapter of not nice reviews, you know, the Dead and ABBA and on, and that's funny, you know. That's hilarious sometimes, especially when you agree with it. But one thing I read. This is when Rock and Roll Confidential, the newsletter, first started. And I'm pretty sure this is when the newspapers would pick up, I'm in Delaware, so we didn't have a major newspaper. We would pick up things from major newspapers. And I think it was the Baltimore Sun. And so I would have made it J.D. Considine doing a piece on Dave and Rock and Roll Confidential. And Dave started talking about basically his love of music, for one thing, but he was talking about, and I think we want to talk about this later, but you know, people put Dave as this rock and roll guy, but Dave's a mainstream guy. I know Dave listens to things on the fringes as well, but Dave first, I think of as a mainstream kind of person, and also it's a wide mainstream. The center is very wide. So you do get the Sex Pistols and things like that. But the quote I remember he was saying, he says, you know, his thing is Joan Jett belongs to me, or that's my territory. He says, I will fight anybody for that because that's the stuff that gets maligned. And yeah, I mean, I think to a degree you do need to be a fan. Dave's best writing is when he's a fan of something, not that he can't have some critical distance. Again, I enjoy all the wisecracks and stuff like that. But when he loves something, or when something he has loved has maybe dropped, disappointed him a little bit, that's all great. That's great writing, to me, about music. I'm done.
Absolutely. Alejandro, as you mentioned, you're the musician in the group here. And I'm really interested in the perspective you bring to this conversation about music writing as a musician. How do you see the relationship between critic and artist ideally? And have Dave or other critics helped you see your own music in new ways?
Absolutely. It's given me, there are times like, I don't know if you know this, but after the True Believers broke up, I was working in a record store in Austin, Waterloo Records, right? And I was working there when my first solo record came out, right? I'm still working a job. And I remember we got the first review. The first one that I read was from Tom Jurek. And he wrote a review of my first album. And it was beautifully written. It was really passionate. And I suddenly saw my music in a way that I hadn't seen it before, And it gave me more confidence in what I was doing because I hadn't done it in a while. I was kind of shaky about it. The other thing that I can tell you is that, like, when I was working with John Landau, and, one of my favorite treasures from that period of time is John's critical notes about the songs. I would send him songs, and then he would give me back a critique on each song. And it wasn't just about, a particular word or what that, although he would address those kind of things, but it was more about the big picture, how the song, where the song placed itself in the view of the world and social issues or whatever it was we were talking about. So, I think that criticism, in much the same way that the French New Wave had critics that became film directors and how important that was for film, I think that music critics are the good ones. And I came from an era where there was an abundance of really great writers, all those guys were amazing. It was very important in shaping what I ended up playing even, how I played, what I listened to. I try to listen to everything. I really do. I try to give everything a chance, and so I think that the critic is kind of just this great voice in your head that kind of talks to you and kind of has a conversation about what it is you created. So I personally, I'll tell you this, being a critic's darling can be a curse and a blessing, usually it means I don't sell any records. So, that's part of it. It's wonderful to have that kind of, when a person like Dave Marsh writes about music or my music, when he wrote the article for Real Animal in the Austin Chronicle, it was a big, big step. I think it even brought attention to a lot of people who thought they knew me here in Austin. It's something I reached another level because of Dave's writing, and the way that he interpreted my music. So I think it's incredibly important. I think it's very important, a critic. That's what I got to say about that.
Well, Annie, David, Steve, any thoughts on that relationship between the critic and the artist?
I really appreciate hearing that perspective because as a critic, I'm often unsure how a writing is perceived or how it moves the needle, even though so much is online these days and there's instant feedback from everybody. It's hard to tell, and and I think as a critic, that's the ideal, that if you're writing something and an artist is like I see myself differently, or you illuminated something. I mean, I think that's the ideal. But I think realizing that, this stood out to me with some of, with, I think Pete Townsend talking about Dave, is that, they sparred, they disagreed on things, but ultimately Pete respected Dave. And I think that's always the goal as a critic and artist. Like, maybe I say something about a record and you completely disagree with it. The artist might be like, she's full of shit, or, this is not what I was going for, but at least if you frame it in a way, they respect your opinion. And I think, for me, that's always my goal, that, even if, someone, I might be totally off base, at least you can say, all right, you at least backed up your argument. And so I think, that's kind of my sense from it too.
Looks like, Steve, were you going to say something there?
No.
Hey, David, I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I don't know that I have anything smarter to say, definitely, than Amy and Alejandro have said. Although I didn't know about that Real Animal story that Dave Marsh did for you. So I'm going to track that down.
Yeah, it's a great piece. It's wonderful. And like I said, it really kind of opened the eyes of a lot of people who had, kind of thought they knew me or marginally had heard my name, but it introduced me to a whole different audience. It really did. So, yeah, and I think it's because Dave's writing is so passionate and so articulate and so beautifully written that you can't help but get interested in something that he's that passionate about, In Fortunate Son, there's people that he writes about that I've never heard of, but I'm going to check them out. I want to check them out because of what he said about him, of what he's written about him. So it's important.
That's great to hear. Yes, as a former critic, I guess, I can say that even though, when I wrote more about music, I was always interested in establishing some sort of dialogue between me and readers and artists. And when that dialogue actually happens, it actually gets acknowledged, right? Even if it's a note from a publicist saying, hey, Willie Nile read your review and he thanks you because you really got it. Not thanking me for a positive review. That's not the point, but just that you get it, or like Alejandro and Annie said, that you're helping them hear it in a different way. That's listening. And Steve, I want to move on to a question that will start with you. I think one of Dave's strengths as a writer and critic is his ability to talk about all of these issues that we've talked about so far, the social and cultural and political context and impact and personal response to the music, while at the same time being a very, very astute listener to the sounds themselves. I mean, the bass player, the drummer. I can't count how many times over the years Dave has specifically said, well, the difference between A and B is the drummer. Right. That's why they suck and that's why they're great. Or they used to suck until they got a new drummer, and then they, So, and when I read your writing, and it's hard when I look back at Rock and Roll Confidential, because a lot of those reviews didn't have bylines, right? And that was intentional. But when I see your posts on Facebook now, you're often talking about the way musicians sound and the way they play. So can you talk a little bit about how you thread that needle between the micro and the macro, the sounds and the big picture?
Well, first I ignore lyric sheets. No, it's a record. I mean, that is the first thing. And Dave, in the introduction to this book, 1001, The Heart of Rock and Soul, Dave talks about the impetus for that was Jackson Browne talking to Bill Flanagan about, instead of writing songs, about making records. And that's how I listened. It could be a stupid record. I mean, Dave wrote a whole book on Louie Louie, which is a really good book. Not to say that Louie Louie is stupid, but it's not Dylan-esque in any way, shape, or form. So what is it about the record then? Is it the combination of things? Is the fact that in Louie Louie's case, garbled lyrics? I mean, garbled singing? Is it the bad production that makes it great production somehow? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I love this. Dave, in an email one time, Dave was I think my first point was, my original point was, I didn't waste time thinking about why I didn't like things I didn't like. And first Dave took me to task for that. I'm not sure he follows that because, again, the reviews of like Donnie and Marie, it's not like he gave it a lot of consideration. He'll say, oh, that sucks, which is fine. But he also took me to task for like a lot of times just saying, oh, I like that. I don't really need to know why. And sometimes because that's kind of like, oh, nice beat, easy to dance to kind of thing. So you start saying, Midnight Train to Georgia, or why did I always keep coming back to that the record, not the song, because whenever I'd share a Gladys Knight video, I never would share a live clip because it just wasn't as good. And I'm thinking, well, why do I love this record so damn much? And you think about it, and in this case, Bob Babbitt on bass, and it's the bass line. It's perfect, and not just because he played a great bass line, because this gets into the technical stuff. Somebody mixed it right. The EQ, everything about it is perfect. It's perfectly situated in there, and it's perfectly composed, and so and then you go back and you listen to a live clip and somebody's changed the bass line up and you're like, well, so that's a long way around. Just the sounds. Dave talks about those things a lot. He talks about rhythms, the Bayonne rhythms a lot, any kind of rhythm. Or like you said, the difference between this record and that record is Al Jackson or something, those things are important, I don't know. I could go on probably for an hour and I will not do that.
Well, I often think that it's got a good beat and you can dance to it. That is its own reward, right? That needs nothing else beyond it. It is sufficient unto itself as a good in the world. And it ain't no sin to be glad you're alive. Some of us may know that line, right? So, just because I like it, I think can be, it's fine sometimes. On the other hand, right? So meaning is, I'm not telling people things they don't know here, but meaning is not just the lyric sheet, right? It's the way that those lyrics are sung. And it's not just the lyrics and the way they're sung, it's the way they're sung against that rhythm bed with those accent instruments produced and mixed and engineered in a particular way. And then in conversation with other tracks by that artist in a set or an album, and then those things in conversation with other things on the radio or in the back catalog of the artist in question, and all of that intersecting with social issues, meaning is complicated. And so that's why, Andy's talked before today about listening in context. There's a lot of context. There's context within context. And the music is, paramount, right? And if you're just talking about the words, then, you're missing the boat.
For sure. I think and Steve, you mentioned that we were going to get to this. I think that's a nice lead into the next question I had. And when we were putting this conference together, one of the reasons was that it seems like, and correct me if you disagree, it seems like as we look at the history of rock criticism and rock writing, that a lot of critics from the era that Dave rose, the 70s, when you talk about people like Robert Christgau and Greil Marcus, they are still very much in fashion. And part of that has to do, I think, that's a different conversation. But, Dave, I think, has been unfairly maligned as a quote unquote rockist, right? As someone who sticks to the old outmoded worship of the artist as author and is very rock centric and album centric in his approach to music. Well, like we said, he wrote a whole book on 1,000 singles. He's always been about the records, whether they're 45s or LPs. And in fact, I think David, a few years ago at the PopCon, and I wasn't there, but you know how word spreads. I think you once asked the question, is Dave Marsh the original Poptimist? Could you expand on that a little bit and talk about how that album versus single tension and the rockist versus Poptimist tension plays out?
Did I say that? Okay, so I think in the beginning, all the good rock critics were proto-optimists. And I mean, Marcus and Christgau, definitely there with Marsh. Willis and Bangs, maybe less so, but them too, right? And so what do I mean by proto-optimist? I mean that they all of them valued singles at least as much as albums. They thought that records trump songs. It's great to write a fantastic song, but if you make a lousy record, it doesn't matter, right? They were mainly, all of them, I think. Oh, one of the things that Dave's talked about a lot too is that, you know, there's this idea that the rockist idea is that rock is really at its base, what it does best is it's about rebellion. But as Marsh has pointed out many times, you know, it's, you know, no, reconciliation is also a big part of what it's doing at its best. All of them were taking seriously music that wasn't supposed to be taken seriously, right? And so, and they weren't, they recognized too, I think, that art is artifice by definition. And so therefore they weren't pulled in too much by authenticity stuff. That was not a thing that they focused on very much. But as rock and roll goes on, as rock and roll becomes rock, as criticism becomes codified through the 70s, right? A lot of those binaries, which are obviously just generalizations and more complicated in real life that I just listed, got flipped and turned into kinds of hierarchies. So then by the time you get into the 80s, especially, you know, you're seeing all these lists after great album list where the top 10 or maybe the top 20 are all white guys who are singer-songwriters and play guitar and sing very seriously about serious shit, right? And and so one of the things Dave does in the Heart of Rock and Soul is he sort of, you know, says, wait, we need to do a course correction. This is wrong. And in the introduction to that book, in fact, he sort of, so just as all the good critics were proto-optimist, all the good critics were also took a part in codifying this kind of what we would now call rockist criteria for what counts as good. But Marsh takes a lot of the heat compared to others, particularly because the outsized importance of the Rolling Stone record guides, right? And I think that's a big part of it. And so he mentions this in the introduction to Heart of Rock and Soul, right? Is that, yeah, that I have part of the blame for this. And so then he sets out to write this book. I think he was really well positioned to sort of see what we might think of what would later be called maybe poptimist values, because he came from that moment. He cut his teeth musically in that moment. That's the Dark Ages, after Elvis is in the army and Chuck Berry's in prison and Jerry Lee Lewis marries his cousin and Little Richard goes into the ministry and Buddy Holly's dead, and the arrival of the Beatles to save rock and roll, right? He's in the middle with all the nonsense doo-wop revival and the swooning sentimental balladry of Roy Orbison and Ray Charles and Brenda Lee and all the delights of the Nashville sound, right? And then he's also there for the rise of the girl groups and the rise of Motown right in his hometown, right? And so he's really well positioned to say, yeah, we've gotten off course here and we need to come back. And so I think that's a big part of what makes that book so appealing, is that you know, he's recognizing that the role he played and trying to sort of say, yeah, we need to get back to these things. It's not necessarily about a hierarchy, but these are values we do not want to dismiss out of hand. So that would be why I would have called him the OP.
Sure, the OP. I love it. Annie, as you've already mentioned, you're the youngest of the group here.
Yes.
And so I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
I mean, I think, you know, what's so interesting is that, you know, the idea of what pop is changed over time. So I feel like in various eras that Dave was writing, he would either be seen as a rockist or a poptimist. I mean, he hated MTV. Like they're like, even like after like over a decade after the channel has been on the air, like I found an interview where he basically talked about, I'm going to read this. We will all rot in the pits of hell 5 minutes for every second we've wasted watching MTV. So, but in the 80s, that was pop music, but what's so interesting is that, he gives all his reasons and, it's, videos that aren't going to be seen, career developments out the window, but he also points out that MTV didn't play Black artists. And so, he has obviously, the usual, his forceful, like, I'm going to make these proclamations, but there is actual reasoning behind it. And so that's what I think makes it so interesting, is like you were talking about, it's not an easy binary. I think, and depending on, we were talking, before this started, that I think he was indifferent to Duran Duran, but he liked Culture Club, and, Culture Club has a massive lineage that Boy George loved Motown, and his voice is so very soulful, and he's, a lot of their music sounded, really, really called back to that. So it's very interesting, because I think my perception growing up was that, okay, he's a rockist, but then again, he hated Journey. And I mean, who were a pop band, but also like, a rock band with chops. Neil Schon was in Santana when he was a teenager. So it's not easy to pin him down. And I think that's what's most interesting thing when you actually look at it. I think there are other critics you can point to that are just like, that they would never waver. Like you could probably tell to a T, if you picked out 5 records, you could tell even, before I know which ones they will and won't like. And Dave would also surprise you. I mean, he loved Janet Jackson, and wrote some very positive, great things about Janet Jackson, so I mean, it's very cool. The idea that he was a champion for things that never wavered. And so it's very interesting.
Steve, any thoughts from you on that?
I don't think so right now. I probably later.
All right. Alejandro, we lost him for a moment, but it looks like he's making his way back in, and I want to see if he wants to chime in on that before we move on. And I'm talking really slowly to give him time to get into the room here. But evidently, internet and Zoom issues are getting in the way, which is fine. I want to talk a little bit about how we listen and how the mechanics of listening have changed so radically in the last decade. We've gone from relative scarcity, where the radio only plays so much and you only have enough dollars in your wallet to buy so many records, to one of abundance. Even if Spotify and Apple Music aren't the celestial jukebox that Napster was, right? They don't have everything. But if you want to find something to listen to or sample it, you can do so with relatively low barrier to entry, anywhere, YouTube. How has that changed your listening habits? Has it? And how do you think it's changed listening habits across the board and how we hear music? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to go first.
I mean, I personally think about this a lot because my listening encompasses everything. My husband and I have a massive physical record collection, but we also subscribe to multiple streaming services and satellite radio. And so we pretty much have everything at our fingertips. And honestly, the idea of listening paralysis or listener paralysis comes up all the time, because if I log on to, one of the services and I'm like, what do I want to listen to? It's like, there's just so much choice. It's too much. And I know for me, it kind of manifested itself in that I listen to kind of old favorites or things like, or I'm going to listen to, maybe an 80s music playlist or, a Tommy Keene greatest hits record. And so things that, are like comfort food almost, it's made discovery a little bit difficult. At the same time, and it's this, when we were talking about players and, individual musicians, it's really the flip side of that is that you don't necessarily get that experience of having credits in front of you. And, and I'm always been a liner notes person and saying, all right, who's playing on what, how does this inform how I think? If I see a certain player is on a record or a certain drummer, that'll make my ears perk up a little bit because I know they might have a seal of approval. And sometimes that's gone. And that's something that I miss and that I've tried to seek out. But you have to create it for yourself. It's more of an active process rather than, I have a record, I'm just going to, open up the gatefold. It's something you have to seek out. And that's kind of changed as well. It's just, it's so weird that you have so many choices now, but yet at the same time, it's so much more difficult to find something to listen to. I mean, as a critic as well, I get like no exaggeration, hundreds of emails a day. I get hundreds of promos a week, and you physically can't listen to them all. And it's more like, I'm going to go back to things I know, because trying to sift through everything is just so difficult. And so it's a real challenge. And I know this is something people are grappling with, and there are really no easy answers. But it's a really bizarre situation. It was almost easier when you were a kid and you only had the money to buy 2 records. And so maybe you take them and then learn about them inside and out. And, over the course of a month, that seems like a luxury that's more difficult to attain now.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed as I, am no longer a working critic getting assignments, and Annie, you mentioned earlier the difference between getting asked to review a record that you really don't care about and one that you do. One of the things I've noticed is, and there's not that pressure now. You, as a working critic, you get that pressure to listen to something and have a take on it the day it comes out, right? And at the last panel, the Cream folks were talking about how you could write a review 2 months after an album came out, and it was okay. It wasn't driven by the industry the way it is now. So that also plays into this entire discussion about how we listen to music and how we listen to critics talk about music and what they say being influenced by having to have a review done by 8 a.m. when the record drops at midnight. David or Steve, do you want to talk about your thoughts on the current culture of how we listen?
I am probably poorly positioned to do that, because it's CDs and radio, or regular radio is still what I go through. I love Spotify and Pandora. Like at work, somebody will put on a Pandora channel, and that's kind of cool. Sharing music through Spotify is really good, because before somebody would just send you a list of stuff and you had to go find it. Now it's right there for you. That said, yeah, I need a CD. I need liner notes. I hate computers. Not now, right now I love it, but I just haven't found my way to do that. And as Annie just said, there's so much. I don't know how when people send their Spotify list, and I'm like, I don't know a third of this, or even less, New York Times, like top whatever they do, top 100 or 50 or whatever. I knew like 3 things on the whole list. I'm like, what is all this stuff? And where's Low Cut Connie? Come on.
I get you get 100 promos a week, Annie, and I get 0 promos a year, pretty close, right? And so I don't have that particular problem. What I do have is that, but there's still so much, even if you're just working off of Spotify and like grabbing suggestions from your friends and the people whose ears you trust. It's still, it's changed the way that I listen. Whereas, back in the day, I put an album on and you would let the whole thing spin. And now it's very easy for me to be sitting here and going, yeah, that track hasn't grabbed me in the first 20 seconds. Next. And, the good thing about that is I don't have to listen to that track for more than 20 seconds. The bad thing is that I don't listen for more than 20 seconds. And because to really hear something, I think for me, I'm not a rush to judgment person. I am a rush to judgment person, but I need to fight that tendency within myself. And if I were writing about it, I would be able to battle that off successfully. But if I'm just like trying to keep up or listen for fun, I flit about and taste different things on different trays, and some of the stuff I really enjoy, but I don't get to know anything as deeply as I once did. And part of that's on me, but I also think it's partly the way the world is shaped now.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think, everyone has commented on what a deep, thoughtful listener Dave is, and he encourages that in his readers. But it's hard. I often wonder if, the vinyl revival isn't so much about better sound quality, although maybe it is for some people. Some of it's about the coolness and the hipness factor for some people. But I also think that it's partially a way to say, okay, I'm going to listen to something for at least 20 minutes, one side of a record, right? And not be distracted by the ability, the ease of the ability to move to the next track and move on to the next thing and feel like you have to stay caught up. It really encourages us to be more thoughtful, not and active listeners, right? And really engage with it rather than put it on as background. I just was texting with Alejandro. Unfortunately, a storm just rolled through New Braunfels and knocked out his internet, so he won't be back. But I think now might be a great time to turn to some audience questions. I've got a couple more here, but I know we've got some good questions from the audience. So Danny, if you're there, if you would join us.
I am here. Hi.
All right.
Can you hear me? That's good.
Yes.
That's good. Well, I had one I was kind of holding off for Alejandro. Maybe I won't do that then. But I think this is a good one. I mean, this was a good one for him. And one thing, I was thinking about him and the way he uses like Ian Hunter and Lou Reed and Iggy Pop in his concerts. I always feel like there's the fanboy, there's the critic, like on stage, you know, like I always feel this connection to that, especially because it hits so close to home. It's almost like he's a, it's like eerily was going through something like what I was going through or something. But anyway, this is a good one from Sean Poole. I'm gonna kind of go, they're all good. I'd like to know from the panel their feelings on how much musical knowledge and experience is important for good music critics to have. This often has emerged as a source of tension between musicians and music critics. I recall Dave once writing on this issue something along the lines of, I don't need to write like a professional musician, but rather like a professional listener. But I think with this panel, especially with its mix of musician and writer perspectives, which is why I kind of hope to ask Alejandro about it, it'd be interesting to hear your particular takes on this. Thoughts?
Steve, you're a musician. Why don't you?
I am not really, but on guitar. But
Yes, you are.
I mean, there's a bunch of ways to look at that. Find the Dave Marsh Wikipedia page, and you'll see people complaining about his. Dave is not a big Journey fan, a big Queen fan, or John Bonham fan, and they will point out that those, as Annie pointed out, Journey. I mean, they were stacked with talent, you know, musician talent. Were they stacked with songwriting talent? I don't know. Did they just want to did they want hits really bad and they made it to that format? I don't know. You know, Steve Smith, the drummer, left the band to do jazzy stuff. I think, that quote is right. If he did say you need to be a good listener, you can learn the other stuff. I'm not to be a good musician so much, but to understand what the musician is going through. But I mean, if being a great musician was all it was, I mean, we'd all be listening to Yngwie Malmsteen, and we're not. You know, it's all those intangibles. Are you touching somebody? What does that audience want? You know, and we've become fragmented audiences too. Some people want, and these are revelations to me. When I watched Rush induct Yes into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it made me think of it. You know, they're talking about appreciate excellence. You know, technical proficiency, and is that all that Yes or Rush is? And I don't think it is. You know, so if you can have all of it, you know, the more you can have, the better of all the good stuff. You know, wow, he's a great guitar player. He also listens a lot. He also writes good songs. He writes meaningful songs, or she. I don't know. I don't think you have to be a good musician to critique records or music.
And I agree with that. I think just because it is technique and feel. I mean, I'm left-handed, so I could never play guitar because my dad did not have a left-handed guitar. I tried, didn't work, but I played the flute for 8 years. And so I have a grounding in musical theory. I can't say that it has a lot to do with my music writing, but, playing music for it, like if you play music, you get a sense of how things go together, balance and harmony. And, there's just something that gets kind of ingrained in your brain that makes you, because when you're playing like in a concert band, like I did, you have to listen to what other people are doing. And, and I think that even if it's not necessarily on the surface, that's something that sort of sinks into your brain and makes you kind of, when you hear music or you're experiencing music, you experience it in, a specific way. Because, and then it's funny you mentioned like Russian, yes, because I mean, if you think about, a certain faction of people might say, oh, whatever, Rush are just like, Prague, Prague aficionados, but Neil Peart's lyrics are beautiful. He's written some of the most beautiful, moving lyrics of any band, and so that's, and Rush works because of the combination. So I'm a fan and I could go on forever and I won't turn this into a Rush conversation. But yeah, I think, you don't necessarily need to be a musician, but you have to have your mind open to everything that goes into a song, because you're right. A song is not just, hey, this is a great guitar solo. And this is, your tuning was impeccable. It's everything else that goes into it. It's a lot more, it's greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah,
I think sometimes, real quick, is that if you do play music, though, even like on any level, it will, or try to write a song or whatever, it will give you, it's hard to write a song. It's hard to write a bad song. It's harder still to write a good song. I mean, that somebody writes that people write more than one great song on their own in a lifetime is just, it boggles the mind. So that does, that can play into your mindset too of, Jesus Christ, it's really hard to do that. I mean, they're trying really hard, and you watch somebody try really hard and just not quite get there. I mean, if you play, you have some empathy for that, I think.
Yeah. I can't count the number of times someone has tried to convince me that some track or artist is good by saying, oh man, do you know how hard that is to do? And I got to say, well, no, I really don't. I mean, I can guess it. I couldn't do the simple part, let alone the difficult one. But what all I care about when I'm trying to capture, I'm not even really trying to capture how music sounds so much as how it feels. That's the thing that I'm trying to always get across.
But you always write about how the sounds impact the feel. I mean, you've written a lot about, for instance, countrypolitan production, right? And so you do write about the sound.
No, what I mean is, but I don't know. I can't tell you what the name of that drum pattern is.
Sure.
But I can tell you, when, we can talk about things like the dynamics and when of the drummer and the way it seems to accent words or emotions within the lyric, or the way it seems to stay out of the way and make it, there's a million different ways to talk about it, but I have no knowledge of, as I just demonstrated, I have no knowledge of actually, how to play drums, which is probably the instrument I would want to play. If you could, snap your fingers and I could play one, I would want to be a drummer. And I admire drummers. Like Jerry Kerrigan is on a lot of those. The late Jerry Kerrigan is on a lot of the countrypolitan records I admire. And I can pick him out from other, like from Kenny Buttry, for example, or Tommy Markham, or other drummers of that time. But yeah, I'm a musical illiterate. I am, I think, a good listener. So.
That's good. Should I move on?
Yeah.
I do think both you, David, and Dave, and this goes for everybody here, I'm sure, there's a tendency to pay a lot of attention to what the music is. What we're really talking about is, are you talking about it as a musician or as a listener, right? And I think that's, you use different vocabulary, James Baldwin's come up a few times, but that whole thing at the end of Sunny's Blues, where he doesn't use any musical vocabulary to describe the performance at the end of that, but it's beautiful. It's anyway. Sorry.
No,
I'm on the panel. So here's a good one for critics. Does any of you have any experience of misjudging a record when writing a review? did the short time of exposure to it or a lack of understanding of where the artist was coming from and your perception of the record changed over time?
Absolutely. And the fun part is with the internet is that it lives forever. So I can find things I've written 15 years ago that I'm like, what was I talking about? So, which is always good because the embarrassment doesn't, fade away or just, get buried in a magazine. It lives forever for anyone to Google and find. And that is the perils of, of having to make a snap judgment or not being able to spend a lot of time with a record. And I think that goes back to also the way we listen now, that maybe you listen to 20 seconds of a song, it doesn't grab you, you're like, all right, but you might hear the song in a different context. Maybe you're out and about, and you hear it in a store, or you happen to catch the band live and you hear the song and it changes the way you listen to it. And I think about that a lot because, there's so much that we miss now because we just aren't able to kind of spend that deep time with it. And if you misjudge a review and you write something, it's one of those things where you kind of have to, just kind of, move on and, and maybe if someone brings it up, you say, yeah, I wouldn't do it this way now, and things like that. But I think that's just the nature of the game, and as you get older, your listening changes, you might hear a record completely differently as an adult than you did as a teenager. And so I think that, as you kind of get more context and live more life, that also changes the way you hear things. And so I think there's a lot that goes into that too.
I think also that sort of the flip side of the question I asked earlier about being a fan influencing the way you hear things, we all as critics or other listeners bring all sorts of other biases to how we listen. Right? I mean, Rush is a perfect example. I dismissed them out of hand for years because of my biases about what their type of music, as I classified it, was even capable of. Right? Because I had pinholed them as a bunch of prog rockers who cared more about being able to play in weird time signatures than as artists who cared about creating something that would connect with fans and have meaning. I didn't give them a fair shake. I'm still not a huge Rush fan, but I've got moving pictures in the Crater Records behind me now. So.
And, and I have bands like that too, that over the years I've dismissed out of hand. And then, either because I've met passionate fans or, I've read something that's made me reconsider them, it's changed my mind, and I think the idea that, your fandom is never set in stone, I think I think that's something that's, there's always that curiosity. If you have that curiosity and that inquisitive nature, there's always the possibility your mind might be changed. And I think there's a lot of that in Dave's writing too. I think that came up earlier. That's just as a listener, I think that's just something really important to keep in mind too.
I'm not sure if I'm sure I would need to reevaluate some sort of review I've done in the past, but I don't tend to go back and look at them. So I can't verify that. And more recently, in the work that I'm proudest of, my mature phase, I tend to only write about stuff that I like, right? I mean, I'm not doing the weekly review work that Annie's doing, where she's actually going to be writing about all sorts of things. I get to pick and choose what I'm going to write about, and I tend to get to do deeper dives into that particular work. So I get to spend enough time with it usually and have the word count. I publish less often as a result of it, but I feel confident that my judgments in those cases I'm content with them. So, but I'm in this, different space than what Annie's talking about.
Yeah, Annie talked about context as well. Grateful Dead, for me, it was like, a lot of people do dismiss them, and I did for a long time, kind of lightheartedly. I wasn't mad at them, but there's a show called American Roots, if you're familiar with this radio program, and they would. It's just a lot of older jazz, R&B, and things like that, and they would slip these Grateful Dead records in, and it made me hear them. It made me hear like Jerry Garcia as part of that, not as some thing over here that jams. The live stuff, even the live stuff now, I wouldn't buy it, but I'm thinking, you know what? I can listen to this if I have to, but I don't know, you just hopefully you keep growing. The thing is, I want to be a music fan. I really do want to like everything I hear. And of course I don't, but, and I'm always kind of bummed when I get something and I don't like it, or I'm looking forward to something and it just, man, I wish I liked that. But, the possibility is always there. And I hope to like more stuff as I get old.
Okay. Karen Rose, who interviewed John Landau last night, is asking this question. In some ways, maybe this pertains to you, Annie, more than anybody else, just because of what you're doing. But how do you see the role of the critic in a world where all music is available for free at any time? This came up in the last panel about Cream, taking seriously the responsibility to help kids spend their money wisely.
I think Karen probably did this just for me because I'm friends with Karen. No, I'm just kidding. This is like the great existential crisis. It really is about, what is the role of music critics? Are we, do we have a place? Are we useless? Like, why do people read criticism? Like, this is in many, many circles. This is a kind of an ongoing conversation. I think kind of what we talked about, what criticism can do is change your mind about something, make you, even if you hate a record, maybe if you hate an artist, maybe you'll read a piece of writing and say, I will give this a chance. I actually told this to an interview I did recently because, I wrote a book about Duran Duran that a lot of people hate, or band, not the book, but a lot of people hate this band. They think that they have preconceived notions about it. And I said, look, I totally get it. They're not everyone's cup of tea, but, give them a chance, read what I wrote. And at least, maybe it'll change your mind. And I think that's kind of the role of the critic now, is to try to do deep listening, write your truth and put out something that's well written enough that, even the biggest hater of a band might say, okay, I can see what you're going for. I understand your point of view, maybe I'll give this a chance. And I guess part of it is you are kind of, a record guide, like Chris Gow always was too. You're the one who's writing about something, if people, follow your writing or know who you are as a writer, say, look, I think this is worth listening to, maybe you should check this out. And I think that still does have a place. I mean, I have certain writers and critics that I follow and respect. And if they say, hey, you should check this out, like I will, because I'm like, okay, I can see that. I respect their tastes. So I think the difference is that a lot of that's moved online now. A lot of that's sort of, kind of an online, that's happening in the online space, or, via a newsletter, rather than maybe happening in the pages of a print magazine or a newspaper. And so I think it's just sort of evolved a little bit, and I think critics that have sort of evolved a little bit too are probably in a little bit of a better position, but there are no easy answers. This is what keeps you up at night. Do I have a place in this world?
Good. Karen did just write and say, I do want to hear from everyone. so feel free to chime in.
Well, one of the, like in my own reading now, I almost never read, if I can make the distinction between criticism and reviewing, I almost never read reviews anymore, which I really do see as trying to say, okay, here's how to spend your money. It sounds like this, recommended if you like, right? That kind of stuff. Thumbs up, thumbs down. And then criticism, which is actually trying to say, this is why it matters, or this is how it works. This is how it connects with other things happening in the world. It's the artist or the writer is trying to make an argument. And I think that one thing we should probably, keep in mind is that people who want to read that's always been the minority position. That's not, people don't, that's why Marsh accepted, I guess, but that's why Chris Gow and Marcus, they have written many great books and sold some copies, but they don't make it on the bestseller list, right? People didn't pick up Born to Run from Dave because they wanted to hear his, explication of why this music was valuable. They wanted the deets on where he was born and then what he did and who his girlfriend was and what they did next and how he wrote that song, right? Which is a different set of things. Yeah, and so I just think criticism has always been sort of imperiled, but definitely now, everybody's a critic, and or can be if they want to be, and that's a good thing. You know, it's problematic in various ways, but ultimately it's a good thing that everybody now is able to weigh in and engage in these conversations to the extent they want to. I give that a thumbs up.
Anyone else on this?
Sort of tying things together here about that role of the critic as a consumer guide, the easy availability of music now. And all I can think of is that if Spotify had been around 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have spent money on a new Mekons record every time Greal Markets reviewed it. So
Sorry.
I'm not a Mekons fan. I don't hate them. That leads me to something I think, and we got to wrap up here, but I want to close with one of the other things I've learned from Dave Marsh as a listener. And I think he probably got the line from Lee Ballinger, Danny, and you would know this, Lee, who with Dave started Rock and Rap and Rock and Roll Confidential, was it's okay to say, I don't hear it, or I can't hear it. Right. Whether as a critic or a fan, sometimes something just doesn't connect with you, and all sorts of people you do respect, critics, friends, and otherwise, they hear something there, they feel something there, as critics, or more, I guess, David, as reviewers, right? You're compelled to feel like I have to have an opinion on this and I have to make that opinion known, but it's okay to say I don't hear it. But it's not okay to not try to hear it, I guess, or give it a shake. So I know we got some more questions, Danny, but I think we need to wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. David, Annie, Steve, Alejandro, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us for the last few minutes. Everyone's input was extremely valuable and made me rethink some things. And that's as much as anyone could ask. I forgot to mention in my housekeeping at the beginning that we are doing this for free. But if you've a mind to throw a few dollars in the bucket, please consider the Kristen Ann Carr Fund, which is the foundation that Dave Marsh and his wife, Barbara Carr, created 20 some years ago to raise money for sarcoma research and funding sarcoma fellows around the country. And you can find a link on the Land of Hope and Dreams website. We've got another panel coming up today in about an hour called Detroit and Beyond, featuring Marsha Music, John Sinclair, and Wayne Kramer, moderated by Peter Werby. I imagine they'll have said everything they want to say in about 15 or 20 minutes, so it shouldn't really take that long. But it's the last panel of the day, right? So we can just let that one roll. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you all again at future sessions.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Really